The courtroom was tense, filled with a buzz of whispers and exchanged glances. In the front row, a small group of onlookers watched closely, some out of curiosity, others with a sense of disbelief. This wasn't just any trial. This was something bigger, something that would shake the very foundation of the justice system. The air was thick with anticipation, a sensation that seemed to linger with every passing second. At the center of the room, the defendant sat. A young black man, no older than 30, his face a mixture of determination and fear. His posture was straight, but his hands trembled slightly as he sat still, staring ahead. He was no stranger to the weight of the system, to the harsh realities of the world that often failed to see his humanity. But today, things were different. Today, he had a lawyer unlike any other, a woman who had been making waves in the legal world, known for her sharp mind and unwavering belief in justice. Her name was Monica Fields. And then there was the judge, Judge Gregory Hall, a man whose reputation was built on years of presiding over countless cases with a mixture of authority and cold indifference. He was an imposing figure, white-haired and dressed in a robe that symbolized years of experience. His gavel slammed down with the certainty of someone who had been in the game for too long. But it was clear that today was going to be a day he'd never forget. The tension in the courtroom began to rise as Judge Hall called the proceedings to order, his voice grating as he addressed the room. Let the record show that the defendant, Mr. Isaiah Robinson, is being tried for charges of theft, resisting arrest, and assaulting an officer. His tone was dismissive, as though the case was just another routine matter, a mere checkbox on his long list of work for the day. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with judgment, as though he had already made up his mind about the outcome. Isaiah's lawyer, Monica Fields, stood up, her presence commanding the room. She was a woman of color, young and full of fire, her eyes sharp and calculating as she adjusted her glasses and addressed the judge. Your Honor, I request that the court review the charges and consider the context of the situation before making any rash decisions. Judge Hall chuckled under his breath, an arrogant smile playing at the corners of his lips. Context, he mocked. We're here for facts, not excuses. This is the law, Miss Fields, not some political theater. Monica's gaze didn't waver. She had been in tough situations before, but something about the way Judge Hall spoke, so sure of himself, so dismissive, pushed her to the edge. She knew this wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. This was about something bigger. The system, and how it often failed people like him. She wasn't going to let this slide. Your Honor, Monica said, her voice calm but firm, the facts are exactly what we need to examine. I'm here to ensure that the truth is told, not just what you or anyone else assumes to be the truth. The judge's smirk deepened as he glanced at Isaiah, then back at Monica. Truth. You want to talk about truth. How do you explain a man with a criminal record caught red-handed in an attempted robbery? Perhaps your idea of truth is a bit different than mine. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It was clear that Judge Hall wasn't about to let this trial be anything other than a slam dunk. He believed he had the upper hand, that no matter how hard Monica fought, the outcome was already sealed. But little did he know this wasn't just any trial, and Monica wasn't just any lawyer. As the trial continued, Judge Hall's behavior became more and more condescending. Every time Monica spoke, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand or a cutting remark. His eyes, filled with disdain, seemed to focus not on the case but on the young black man in front of him. It was almost as if the trial wasn't about justice, but about maintaining the power dynamics he was so used to. Monica was aware of this. She had seen this kind of bias before, but she had also learned how to fight it. She had studied the law, not just to win cases, but to expose the cracks in a system that often favored those with power and privilege. And today, she was going to expose every single one of them. The courtroom grew increasingly uncomfortable as the back and forth continued. Isaiah's nerves were starting to show, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Monica shot him a reassuring look before turning her attention back to the judge. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the familiar surge of determination that came when she knew she was right. Finally, it was time for her to make her move. "Your Honor," Monica said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, "I request a recess. There is something crucial that needs to be addressed, something that I believe will change the course of this trial." Judge Hall raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested. A recess. What could possibly be so important, Miss Fields? Monica stood tall, her posture now radiating confidence. "What's important, Your Honor, is that you've been operating under a serious misconception. You've been so focused on the charges, on your perception of this case, that you've missed something far more important." The judge's expression darkened, but Monica didn't back down. "I have evidence, Your Honor. Evidence that proves the actions of the defendant were not as they seem, and evidence that will show that your biases and the way you've conducted yourself throughout this trial have compromised your ability to serve as a fair and impartial judge." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The judge's face turned a shade of red that could only signal one thing: panic. He had been caught off guard, and for the first time in the entire trial he looked uncertain. He'd fumbled with his papers trying to maintain some semblance of control, but it was too late. Monica had him. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. "This is highly irregular, Miss Fields. I will not entertain any baseless claims or disruptions." But Monica wasn't listening anymore. She had already presented her evidence. She had uncovered a web of corruption, a series of decisions made by Judge Hall in past cases that raised serious ethical concerns. His track record wasn't just flawed, it was dangerous. And now, it was all on the table. As the court sat in stunned silence, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The man who had held the gavel, who had passed judgment on so many, was now the one under scrutiny. Monica Fields had done it. She had exposed the truth. But the question remained, what would the fallout be? Would this be the end of Judge Gregory Hall's career? Or would he find a way to twist the situation in his favor, using his influence and power to cover his tracks? And what would become of Isaiah? Was his freedom truly at hand, or would the system that had failed him once again find a way to crush him? The answers to those questions would come soon enough. But for now, the courtroom was still suspended in a moment of uncertainty, with everyone wondering what would happen next. The power had shifted, but who would truly hold the upper hand in the end? The courtroom was still the weight of the silence pressing down on everyone present. Monica Fields stood tall, her gaze never leaving Judge Hall. He was visibly rattled, his confident demeanor shattered for the first time in years. He tried to steady himself, reaching for the gavel, as if it could somehow restore his control. But the damage had been done. The evidence Monica had just revealed was undeniable, and everyone in that room knew it. Judge Hall's face twisted in a mix of disbelief and anger. His eyes scanned the courtroom, looking for any sign of support, but none came. The room was filled with a strange energy, a shift that had changed everything. For a moment, he considered calling for a recess, a chance to gather himself. But he quickly realized that doing so would only draw more attention to his panic. No, he had to play it cool. He had to pretend that nothing had happened. "You're treading dangerous waters, Miss Fields," Judge Hall finally said, his voice strained. "This is an outrage. You're accusing me of what exactly? Corruption, misconduct." His voice trembled slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. Monica's expression remained calm, her confidence unwavering. "I'm not accusing you, Your Honor. I'm presenting the truth." She gestured to the stack of documents she had handed over. "You've made a series of decisions that have led to questionable outcomes. In fact, the very manner in which you've handled this case is a glaring example of your biases." The judge clenched his jaw, his hands trembling as they gripped the gavel. He looked over at the prosecutor, who had been silent throughout the exchange. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding the judge's stare. The prosecution's case had already been weak, and now it seemed to be unraveling in front of everyone. Monica was well aware of the risks she had just taken. This wasn't just about defending her client, Isaiah Robinson, anymore. This was about exposing a system that have failed time and time again. A system that often turned a blind eye to the very people it was meant to protect. But even as she stood there, knowing that she had just made a powerful move, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The courtroom door swung open, and in walked the court bailiff, a tall man with a stern expression. His eyes immediately went to the judge, who was still trying to regain some sense of authority. The bailiff whispered something into the judge's ear, his words inaudible to the rest of the room. Judge Hall nodded stiffly, and the bailiff quickly left, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silent room. Monica exchanged a quick glance with Isaiah. The young man had been quiet since the trial began, but now there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. The tension in his posture had eased slightly, but he knew better than to let his guard down. He'd been through too much to believe in easy victories. Judge Hall cleared his throat and slammed the gavel down, though it lacked its usual authority. "This session will continue," he declared, his voice strained. "Miss Fields, your claims will be reviewed, but I will not tolerate these disruptions any longer." His words were sharp, but his lack of conviction was evident. Monica felt the weight of the room's gaze upon her. The whispers had started again, people exchanging uncertain looks, unsure of what to make of the scene unfolding before them. The judge, once the unquestioned authority in the courtroom, was now the one under fire. And as much as he tried to maintain his usual bravado, the cracks were beginning to show. Monica was ready to push further. This was her moment, but she also knew that any wrong move could tip the scales. She had to tread carefully. Every word, every piece of evidence she presented, had to be precise and undeniable. She turned to Isaiah, offering him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry," she whispered. "We're not done yet." As the trial continued, the judge tried to regain control, but the atmosphere had shifted. The very foundation of the courtroom felt unstable, and for the first time in years, Judge Hall was on the defensive. His once unshakable confidence had been replaced with uncertainty. His every word now seemed forced, his attempts to belittle Monica falling flat. But Monica didn't let up. She continued to present her case, detailing the instances of judicial bias that had marred previous decisions made by the judge. Each piece of evidence she introduced seemed to peel away another layer of his carefully constructed facade. She didn't need to shout or make dramatic gestures. Her calm demeanor was far more powerful. She knew the law, and she knew how to wield it like a weapon. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom only grew. The jury had been watching closely, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Some had already made up their minds, while others seemed unsure of what to think. But one thing was clear. Monica was challenging everything they thought they knew about the case, and about the justice system itself. Judge Hall's frustration was becoming more apparent with every passing minute. He had always prided himself on his ability to control a courtroom, to bend the rules to suit his needs. But now, in front of a room full of witnesses and the sharp scrutiny of a lawyer who was playing by the book, his tactics were failing him. Monica could see the cracks in his demeanor. He was trying to keep up appearances, but the fear was there beneath the surface. He knew that his career was hanging by a thread, and it wasn't just about this case. It was about everything he had done in the past, everything he had swept under the rug. And that's when it happened. A sharp metallic sound echoed from the back of the courtroom. The door swung open again, but this time it wasn't the bailiff. Instead, a man in a dark suit stepped in, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was tall, his face obscured by a set of sunglasses, but there was something about him that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing. His demeanor was cold, calculated, almost predatory. Judge Hall's expression changed the moment he saw the man. It was subtle, but Monica caught it, the brief flash of panic in the judge's eyes. The way his hands clenched around the gavel, as if the man's presence alone had caused him to lose his bearings. The newcomer walked down the aisle, his every step deliberate, almost as if he were walking into a battlefield. He reached Monica and Isaiah's table, his gaze lingering on them for a moment before turning toward the judge. Monica couldn't place it, but something about the man felt wrong. There was an air of authority around him, one that didn't belong to any regular courtroom observer. And from the way the judge was reacting, Monica knew this wasn't a coincidence. The man in the suit spoke for the first time, his voice deep and calculated. "Your Honor, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The room fell silent once again. All eyes turned to the stranger, the tension now so thick it was suffocating. Who was this man? And why did his presence seem to throw Judge Hall into a state of near panic? Monica's mind raced as she studied the scene before her. Something wasn't right, and she was determined to figure out what it was. The man in the dark suit stood there, staring at Judge Hall with an unsettling calmness. His silence seemed to echo throughout the courtroom, each passing second stretching longer than the last. Monica could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She hadn't expected this. The tension in the room was palpable, so thick that it seemed to smother the air itself. Judge Hall's expression shifted from fear to something else, something colder. It was a subtle change, but enough for Monica to catch it. He wasn't afraid anymore. No, now he was calculating. He was trying to figure out who this man was and why he had shown up at such a crucial moment. The judge's eyes darted between the man in the suit and Monica, trying to make sense of what was happening. His grip on the gavel tightened. The stranger's voice broke through the silence again. "Your Honor, I'm here on behalf of the state." The words were simple, but they felt weighted like a silent threat hidden beneath the surface. "It seems there's been a grave mistake, and I'm here to set the record straight." The air in the room seemed to grow even colder. Monica exchanged a quick glance with Isaiah, who was still trying to process what was going on. He leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing. Monica's mind raced. Who was this man really, and why did his presence make the judge so uneasy? Judge Hall cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "State? What state? Who sent you?" His voice was sharp, a stark contrast to the apprehension in his eyes. The stranger didn't flinch. "I have no need to explain myself, Your Honor. But you should know that I'm not here to discuss your court case." His words were crisp, as though they were rehearsed, delivered with an icy precision that sent a shiver down Monica's spine. "This case goes much deeper than you think." Monica's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked before she could stop herself. She couldn't help it. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from confusing to dangerous, and every instinct she had screamed at her to be careful. The stranger's gaze shifted toward her for the first time, his eyes hidden behind the dark sunglasses. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice laced with something darker. A promise, a threat. Monica's mind whirred as she tried to piece everything together. Who was this man? Why did he seem so confident, so sure of himself? And why was Judge Hall suddenly so small? The judge, who had always worn his arrogance like a badge of honor, now seemed like a man caught in a web of lies, struggling to keep his cool in the face of something he didn't understand. The silence was deafening, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Judge Hall finally spoke, his voice betraying a hint of panic. "What exactly are you implying?" His hand hovered over the gavel, but he didn't strike it. The power he once held in the courtroom was slipping away from him with every passing second. The man in the suit didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the door, where the bailiff had reappeared, this time with another figure by his side. This new figure was tall and lean, dressed in a sharp black suit, but there was something unmistakably different about them. Their presence was commanding, and their eyes locked with Monica's, sharp and calculating. The stranger's eyes were cold, as if they were measuring her every move. Monica's instincts screamed at her to stay alert. Something was happening, something she didn't fully understand. But she could feel the growing weight of it, and it was clear that the judge wasn't the only one who had something to lose. The new figure stepped forward, their eyes never leaving Monica. "Miss Fields, I'm afraid we need to discuss this matter in private," they said, their voice low and serious. Monica narrowed her eyes, her hands tightening on the edges of her seat. "Discuss what?" "I'm not going anywhere until I know what's going on here," she replied, her tone firm. The stranger in the dark suit finally spoke again, his voice dripping with authority. You should have known better than to think this was just a simple case. This goes much higher than you could possibly imagine. And if you want to get to the bottom of it, you'll need to follow our lead. Monica felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had no intention of backing down now, not after everything she had uncovered. But she also realized that she was stepping into something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. She glanced at Isaiah, who was just as confused as she was, but his eyes showed a flicker of determination. He wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him either. The judge's voice broke through the tension. "Enough," he shouted, his temper finally snapping. His eyes were wild, his face flushed. "I won't be bullied in my own courtroom. This is my domain." But the man in the dark suit didn't flinch. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering. "This is not your courtroom anymore. You've overstayed your welcome." Monica's mind raced. What was happening here? Who were these people? And why was the judge so afraid of them? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was much bigger than a simple case of judicial misconduct. There were forces at play here, forces that had been operating in the shadows for far too long. She turned to Isaiah, her heart pounding in her chest. "Do you know who they are?" she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. Isaiah shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," he whispered back. "But I don't think we're dealing with ordinary people. This feels like something much bigger than just us." Monica nodded slowly, her mind whirling. This wasn't just about proving the judge's corruption anymore. This was about exposing a system that had been working against them all along. A system that had made sure people like Isaiah never had a fair chance. And if it didn't act fast, it would swallow them whole. The man in the suit turned toward the judge, who was now visibly shaking. "You've made your choices, Judge Hall," he said coldly. "Now he will face the consequences." Monica held her breath, waiting for the next move, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this moment could change everything. But what would happen next? She didn't know, but she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a battle, one that could cost them all everything. And as the tension reached its peak, she realized that the war was just beginning. Monica's breath hitched as she watched the man in the dark suit take a step forward. The room seemed to contract, suffocating in the mounting tension. Every instinct in her body screamed that this moment was pivotal. This was the breaking point. But what came next? She couldn't quite say. The judge's last words hung in the air like a challenge. He had lost control, and his once confident demeanor had fractured beyond repair. The man in the dark suit didn't acknowledge the judge's bluster. He merely shifted his gaze to the other figure who had entered the courtroom. This second person who had silently commanded attention the moment they stepped through the door. It was impossible to ignore the authority they exuded. Their eyes didn't waver from the judge, and in that brief moment, Monica saw something that made her pulse quicken. A deep, unwavering sense of purpose. "Judge Hall," the new figure spoke, their voice smooth, their tone an ice-cold reminder that everything he knew was now at stake. "You've miscalculated. You've underestimated who you've been dealing with." Monica's heart raced. She had no idea who these people were, but one thing was clear. Whatever had been set into motion in this courtroom, it was far beyond what she had anticipated. She exchanged a quick glance with Isaiah, who was tense, his knuckles white against the armrest. He was on edge too, trying to gauge what was happening, but even he seemed to know this was no ordinary confrontation. The man in the dark suit took another step closer to the judge, closing the distance between them. The once composed Judge Hall, now visibly rattled, clenched his fists in front of him, the gavel still resting in his trembling hand. "What is it that you want from me?" Judge Hall spat, his voice now full of desperation. He was a man on the edge, grasping at the last shred of power he could hold on to. It was evident in his posture, in the way he kept shifting his weight, trying to maintain control, even as his grip slipped further from his reach. The stranger didn't flinch. "What we want from you, Judge Hall," he began, his voice steady, "is for you to face the consequences of your actions. You've made your bed. Now you will lie in it." His words were sharp, final, and they sent a chill through Monica's spine. The threat hung heavy in the air. But still the judge fought back, trying to regain his composure. "You can't do this. You're just some thugs." His voice cracked with the strain of his own crumbling authority. "I am a judge. You have no right." The man in the suit raised a hand, cutting him off with a motion so casual it made the room feel even more suffocating. "Right?" he said with a wry smile. "Right? It's not about right. Judge Hall. It's about power, and you've been on the wrong side of that for far too long." Monica's breath caught in her throat. She was caught between the burning desire to know more and the growing dread of what would happen if she did. The threads were tightening around them all, and the tension in the room only escalated with each passing second. The man in the dark suit motioned to the lean figure standing next to him. The other figure's cold, calculating gaze never left the judge. They stepped forward, their movements deliberate, purposeful. "You know," the figure said, their voice low and controlled, "you've been playing a dangerous game, Judge. And now the stakes are higher than you could have ever anticipated. It's time to stop pretending you have the upper hand." A cold silence followed as Judge Hall seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that he was out of his depth. His earlier bravado dissolved completely. The walls that had once protected him, the privilege of his position, the respect people had for him, began to crumble in the face of these unknown forces. "Who are you?" Judge Hall demanded, his voice cracking with panic. He looked between the man in the dark suit and the silent figure beside him, his mind racing. But there was no answer, no comfort to be found. Monica felt a chill run down her spine. She had never seen someone so consumed by fear before, not like this. Judge Hall, the man who had mocked and belittled, was now desperately clinging to the last remnants of his power, but it was slipping fast. She felt Isaiah shift beside her, his body rigid as if he too understood that something much bigger than a courtroom trial was unraveling before them. Monica couldn't look away. There was something dark and menacing about the way the two figures were operating, calm, collected, and utterly in control. And then, without warning, the silent figure reached into their suit pocket and pulled out a small envelope. They handed it to Judge Hall with a simple gesture, as though presenting the final verdict. Monica watched as the judge hesitated, his eyes flicking between the envelope and the faces of the two figures in front of him. He looked like he was about to protest, but then he froze. His hands trembled as he took the envelope, the weight of it unmistakable. For a moment, the room held its collective breath, waiting for the judge to open it. Monica could feel the electricity in the air as the judge slowly tore open the envelope, his hands shaking, and pulled out the contents. The paper inside was simple, though the words on it were far from it. He scanned it quickly, his face growing paler with every passing line. His eyes widened in disbelief as he read. Monica leaned forward, straining to see what was on that paper. But before she could make it out, the judge's expression shifted from shock to anger. "No," he hissed, his voice filled with a sense of betrayal and fury. "You can't do this. This isn't real." The man in the dark suit's voice cut through the air like a blade. "It's real, Your Honor, and your time is up." Judge Hall stumbled back, his mind clearly unraveling. The power he had once taken for granted had slipped out of his grasp, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He was no longer the man in control, the judge presiding over his courtroom with an air of superiority. Now he was the one on trial, exposed, vulnerable, and surrounded by enemies. Monica's heart pounded as the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. The judge had been the one pulling the strings for so long, but now the tables had turned. Everything she had worked for, everything she had uncovered, had led them to this moment. But there was still so much left to figure out. What was in that envelope? What did it mean for the judge? And what would happen next? The silence in the courtroom grew oppressive, and all Monica could do was watch as the moment stretched on, knowing that the resolution, whatever it might be, was just beyond the horizon.